Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico Episode 14, Interim Explorers. Last time we talked about the conclusion and lasting impact of the Coronado Entrada, and what it meant for Spanish expansion into New Mexico. This time, we'll continue with the next generation of explorers to New Mexico. To talk about the second set of expeditions, we need to talk about the Spanish expansion into the Mexican north and the establishment of Zacatecas. In the 1540s, Cristobal de Oñate and several others established a series of mining settlements in the area of Zacatecas. Sometime between 1550 and 1552, his second son, Juan de Oñate y Salazar, would be born. Mostly, these settlements to the north were mining towns, profiting off of the wealthy silver deposits in the area. In 1543, reforms in the laws regarding the establishment of Spanish colonies would be passed. It outlined the process by which a potential conquistador would apply for the license to establish a colony, as well as reforms for the treatment of native people, but it was not seriously enforced until 1573. We'll talk a little bit about these laws later in this episode. While between Coronado and the next major expedition, there were probably innumerable slave raids into the northern frontier, perhaps even as far as New Mexico. The details of these raids, if they occurred, are lost. Some other things would change between Coronado and the next set of expedition. The goals of these expeditions, from a profit standpoint at least, was to find mineral deposits that had not yet been exploited and to begin exploiting them. Spanish had also begun to lower their standards for encomiendas. New Mexico is more attractive through these lenses. After all, Coronado had found some shiny metal that the Spanish believed could be silver. In the late 1560s, Santa Barbara, one of the northernmost Spanish settlements at the time, would be founded in what today is central Mexico. In 1570, Allende, a Spanish mission, was founded nearby. At this mission, there would be a lay brother, Agustin Rodriguez. While working with the Conchos in the area, he would learn of the pueblos to the north. Sometime in 1580 or 1581, he began to organize an expedition to these northern kingdoms with the help of one Francisco Sanchez, known as Chamuscado, due to his red beard. Father Rodriguez would be the religious head and Chamuscado the military head of what would become known as the Chamuscado-Rodriguez expedition. In total, the two men would recruit 8 soldiers, 2 friars, and at least 19 Indian allies. How much of a driver Father Rodriguez really was compared to Chamuscado is a topic of scholarly debate. Usually, Chamuscado is given top billing, though. In early June 1581, they set out from Santa Barbara. Like most future expeditions, they would take a more direct route to New Mexico compared to that of Coronado. Few maps of these expeditions are available on the website. They followed the Rio Florido to the area of modern Cuchillo Porrado. From here, they followed the Conchos to San Juan Bautista to the Rio Grande. From here, they followed the river to the pueblo of San Bernardino. What, if any, exploration conducted by the expedition to this point is not well known. From San Bernardino, they continued onwards, staying with a group they called the Humanos. Whether these Humanos were just one group of many displaced from Texas or an individual group is unknown. Several other names are given during this period in the record, and it is possible these names are all different groups or all the same group. On their way north, they would get lost, their diarist Gallegos writing, quote, "On leaving the valley of Los Valientes, we went on another 4 days in search of the settlement of which we had been informed. We did not locate it, so we thought the Indians had deceived us, but we did not lose courage on that account. We pressed forward, going up the same river yet another 5 days to see if we could find the place. But as we found nothing after 15 days of travel, we decided to assemble and discuss the question of whether we should return to Christian lands. For, according to what the natives had told us, we were lost. Our latest informants had said the settlements were 7 days away. Others had previously said 5. And we had marched for 15 days through an uninhabited land without seeing anyone." End quote. On August 21st, 1581, they finally arrived at the Piro Pueblos, though. But the people who lived there had fled. They claimed the kingdom in the name of Spanish crown and named it San Felipe de Nuevo Mexico. A later explorer, Antonio de Espejo, would shorten that title to Nuevo Mexico. Gallegos writes about their arrival at San Felipe, quote, "When we had learned that there was beyond from the account of the Indian, we went on with him as our guide. Farther up the same river, we came to an abandoned pueblo that had been inhabited by a large number of people, who must have been very advanced, judging by the buildings, and whose discovery would be of great importance if they could be found. The said pueblo was walled in, and the houses had mud walls, and were built of adobes, 3 stories high, so it appeared. though they had crumbled from the rains and seemed to have been abandoned for a long time." End quote. From here they set out visiting most of the pueblos. They may have visited the Tampiro pueblos in the Estancia area, or modern Torrance County, New Mexico, although it is considered that Antonio de Espejo, who we'll talk about shortly, was the first to actually visit the Tampiro pueblos. As they continued, they traveled to the plains, possibly making it as far as the Canadian River, before returning to the pueblos. Of the 3 friars, 2 that had accompanied Rodriguez would stay behind. At least one would be killed before the expedition left, although it is unclear if the expedition knew that at the time that they left. There would be some resistance by the pueblos against the Spanish, causing the Spanish to respond. Quote, "When the leader realized that the soldiers were right, he ordered Pedro de Bustamante, the notary, and other soldiers to place a block in the middle of the camp's plaza, where the rest of the Indians were watching, and to cut off the heads of the prisoners with an iron machete as punishment for them and as an example to the others. Preparations were carried out as ordered. Although, as the friars had decided to remain in that settlement, it was agreed that at the time when the Indians were to be beheaded, the friars should rush out to free them, tussle with us, and snatch the victims away from us, in order that the Indians might love their rescuers, who were resolved to remain in the land." End quote. This tactic of Franciscans intervening was a common tactic from the Spanish in the New World. How effective it was is hard to say. On their return trip, Chamuscado would get ill and die, being buried on their return route. The expedition would return to Santa Barbara on April 15, 1582, less than a year after they had set out. Their return would set off another round of rumors reminiscent of those Cabeza de Vaca had created. The authorities in Santa Barbara would try to arrest the men from the expedition, especially one Hernan Gallegos, the expedition's diarist. The authorities wanted to make sure they would be able to control who went to conquer this new land, much like they had done with Cabeza de Vaca 50 years earlier. Despite this, Gallegos and another man would escape back to Mexico City with their reports. In the meantime, some scrambled to begin getting their licenses to establish a colony in New Mexico. About these licenses, as I mentioned, in 1573, the Spanish would begin to enforce those colonization laws to try and control the expansion of the empire. There's one specific clause we're interested in reading, and it goes as such. Quote, "No person, regardless of status or condition, shall by his own authority undertake any new discovery, neither by sea or land, or embark on any expedition to a new population or settlement in lands that have been discovered, or about to be discovered, without our license and provision, or that of an official whom we authorize to give such permission, under penalty of death and confiscation of all goods by our chamber, and we order that none of our viceroys, audiencias, governors, and other justices of the Indies issue any license to undertake new discoveries without first sending it to us for consultation and approval." End quote. However, there were some among those who wanted to go that decided it would be better to beg for forgiveness, such as Antonio de Espejo. Antonio de Espejo was a successful cattle rancher that had been hiding out in Santa Barbara from some legal trouble he had gotten into. The story of that legal trouble goes as follows. In April 1581, one of Espejo's men, a Sebastian Lopez, pretended to be sick so that he wouldn't have to work that day. In a rage, Espejo threatened to kill him. Due to these threats, 4 of Espejo's men would desert. These 4 men would head into a nearby town where at least 2 of the men's wives were staying. In this town, they would encounter some of Espejo's loyal men. A scuffle would break out, and at least 1 man would die. One of the surviving men would go to the local alcalde, or mayor. There would be an investigation, and Espejo would be fined. Instead of paying the fine, Espejo skipped town to hide in Santa Barbara. Here he would decide that he could get another profit to be had in New Mexico. Some experts among the Spanish had estimated that some 300 men would be needed to pacify the province based on reports received to date. Espejo decided he was going to lead a smaller reconnaissance mission of 15 men to check in on the friars that had been left behind. Fray Bernardino Beltran agreed to get the paperwork handled, while Espejo set out ahead. They would set out on November 10th, 1582, largely shadowing Chamuscado's route. At the Rio Grande, they would meet some of the same people Chamuscado had. From their interpreters, they learned that the friars may have still been alive. At this point, they also elected Espejo as the official leader of the expedition. In early January, they'd make it to roughly El Paso, continuing on to some abandoned pueblos, possibly near Elephant Butte, before they made it to the Piro pueblos. Here they learned both friars had been killed. They would give a good description of a Kewa, though while describing the pueblos. From Diego Perez de Luxon's account, quote, "The people are idolatrous, for the pueblo had 4 caverns in the plaza, where they had their dances and their baths, and these places served as a community center and lodging place for strangers. In front of each one, outside the entrance, is a black stone, 4 fingers in thickness, 3 spans wide, and 1 estado above the ground. And on each kiva is a badly painted figure of an Indian with a flaming crown. Everyone has these idols in his house." End quote. There's some notes in here. In this case, caverns was a Kewa, and they're not 100% sure if these paintings were on the Kewa itself or on the stones, based on the research I saw. A span is about 9 inches, and an estado was an old unit that comes in at about 1.67 meters, or about 5.5 feet. They briefly discussed establishing a fortress in the area, and then sending a smaller party ahead, but decided that it would be safer to bring all 15 men together, rather than to send out a smaller group. They did some exploring to the Tampiro, or East Antigua pueblos near modern-day Socorro. From there, they headed to the pueblo of Pararay, which is located somewhere between Bernalillo and Albuquerque. They spent some time at this pueblo, trying to get the people to return. While in the Rio Grande Valley, they would also write about what the pueblos remembered about Coronado's time there. Quote, "We learned from the interpreters that 2 of Coronado's captains were in this pueblo for 2 years, that from here they went to discover some provinces, and that when Coronado was at Paula de los Martires, he came to the above-mentioned pueblo of Acamoa, made war on the inhabitants of Paula, who are Tiguas, and those of the surrounding district, had killed 10 of the horses left there by Coronado for the people in the garrison. When Coronado heard of the incident, he set out for Paula, whose people are Tiguas, and besieged them near a pueblo encircled by mountains. Pressed them so hard that those who did not die at the hands of the Spaniards, Coronado's people, whom the natives called Castillos, died of hunger and thirst." End quote. I also have the following notes regarding this quote as well. Paula de los Martires was where the friars had been killed. Luxon then continues, quote, "Finally the people of Paula surrendered and threw themselves on Coronado's mercy, and he took as many, both men and women, in his service as were necessary, and returned to this pueblo. From here he set out for the valley of Zamora, which must be 100 leagues distant from this province." End quote. In late February, they visited Keres Pueblo before visiting Jemez and Zia. At the beginning of March, they visited the Zuni Pueblos. On the way, Espejo would leave some men at what would become the site of Laguna Pueblo while he made a quick side trip to Acoma, and in mid-March they would finally arrive at Matasaki. Early April, when they would go to visit the Hopi, leaving 8 men and one of the friars behind. They claimed one Hopi Pueblo in mid-April and toured the rest. From there, they would select 5 men to continue on and explore some potential mines to the west. The rest were going to return to Zuni. At the end of April, they went west to somewhere in the area of Verde, Arizona. Overall, they were disappointed by the mines, but Espejo would write favorably about the mines in his bid to be colonizer of New Mexico. When the whole party reassembled at Zuni, they were divided into 2 factions. One faction wanted to return, since their stated mission, to check on the friars, had been completed. Meanwhile, the other faction wanted to continue exploring the prospects of the territory. They had heard about some mines to the east, and they wanted to scout them out. In the end, the return faction would leave. Only 9 men would remain for further exploration. At the end of May, they would finally leave, briefly camping at Acoma, while Espejo tried to round up some deserters. While at Acoma, they would get into a fight with one of the nomadic tribes, which was either the Navajos or the Cocheros. With his smaller party, he found the Pueblos to be much more hostile to him, having to seize and kill some people at Pararay. In late June, they would head towards the mines they had heard of to the east. Here, things get kind of sketchy as the specific Pueblos they visited. After visiting these mines, they visited the Pueblos of Galisteo before heading on to Pecos, arriving in the middle of June. They would kidnap 2 guys from Pecos and later meet 3 Humanos who agreed to guide them to the Rio Grande. They would arrive back in Mexico on September 10th, 1583, 10 months from when they had set out. Espejo would then write a glowing report about his expedition. While they had been gone, the king would issue a credula dated April 19th, 1583 to establish a colony in New Mexico. With another favorable account, people are even more excited at the opportunity for a colony. Before we get to actually would get the rights to establish a colony in New Mexico, based on this credula though, we've got a few more expeditions to cover. In 1590, Gaspar Castaño de Sosa, the lieutenant governor of Nuevo Leon in northern Mexico, would abandon his post to colonize New Mexico. De Sosa had a history of founding towns and mines along the northern frontier of Mexico, but few of these towns had amounted to much. To get the people out of the town he had most recently established to leave, he would go into such lengths as drop her into a sample to raise the assay, claiming that the doctored sample was from New Mexico. In the meantime, he would twice attempt to get the license to establish the colony, but both times he would be denied. In June 1590, the viceroy would go so far as to send him a note outlawing his slave raids and expressly forbidding him from going to New Mexico. De Sosa would give the following reason for leaving. Quote, "The reason for abandoning my former settlement was sufficient in my opinion, in that the mines were unprofitable and lacking in ores. Were there any, they did not contain enough silver to pay even for the charcoal used in smelting. Surely this explanation will be believed, since we had constructed water mills and others run by mule power for smelting, grinding, and refining, which we would not have abandoned without cause after everything had been done so laboriously and at, God knows, what expense. This work cost me more than 15,000 pesos, for most of which I am in debt. Moreover, I had in operation a farm from which I obtained many supplies. All of these things were lost because there was no silver, and the land was such that we could not support ourselves there without resorting to acts which would have been, in a sense, wrongful. That was the principal reason for abandoning the site. In addition, the settlers and other people were leaving the region." End quote. Another chronicler, Leon, writing in the 1600s, explained his reason for leaving in such, quote, "In reality, the entrada to New Mexico of Castano de Sosa represented nothing more than a flight, the intent to put space between him and the authorities, in view of the unique and weak legal status of his governorship." End quote. Some have linked de Sosa's family to the crypto-Jewish communities of Nuevo Leon, implying that it's possible he was also part of which I plan to write an entirely different episode about. It is possible that with the arrest of his boss, Governor Carajaval, he decided to flee to the north, put some distance between himself and the authorities. His expedition was also the only one of the period to not include a member of a religious order. Regardless of his reasons, in July 1590, the expedition would leave for New Mexico, arriving on the Rio Grande in September. Unable to find the mines, he would begin going on slave raids. These raids would, while bringing in potential profit, also kept the men busy, so that they would not desert. While the exact route is disputed, it is thought that they were around Villa Acuna. Eventually, they would leave the Rio Grande and continue on to Pecos, probably arriving near Sheffield, Texas in late October. Overall, crossing the Pecos River was difficult before the water was diverted for other uses. The rediscovery of New Mexico describes the river as such, quote, "Its banks are as perpendicular as the walls of an edifice, rising 6 feet above the water, to the level of the valley composed of mud, which on drying falls into an impalpable powder. An animal may wander along its banks for half a day without finding a point where he may drink. Indeed, in my 20 miles ride along it, I saw but one point on either side where he could do so, and these were the artificial excavations where we crossed." End quote. They would follow the river, staying on one side until the Roswell Artesia area. This is where they would begin to travel on whichever side was easier to traverse. By late November, they were running low on food, so de Sosa sent a few men ahead to scout for supplies and to scout the area. If they found a pueblo, though, they were not supposed to enter. He would continue on until December 23rd, when his men would return empty-handed. They had arrived at Pecos, and, despite their orders, entered the pueblo. At first, things were peaceful when they entered the pueblo, leaving their equipment in a building. The next day, they were attacked, losing half of their equipment. De Sosa would continue on to Pecos, arriving on New Year's Eve. A fight would break out and he would take the pueblo. But while he took the pueblo, he was unable to capture anyone. So de Sosa laid a trap. He pretended to abandon the pueblo, but left 4 men behind. When some of the inhabitants returned, they were able to capture 2 guides. His exact route from here is sketchy. De Sosa may have gone through Glorieta Pass, and as far north as Taos. Alternatively, he may have gone via the Galisteo Pueblos. He may have visited the Kewa or San Juan Pueblos instead. On his return, he visited the Keres Pueblos, arriving in late January. On February 15th, they would camp at San Cristobal Pueblo. He would have to make a quick trip back to Pecos to reestablish order, meeting no resistance. They would continue on to Keres Pueblo, historically called Santo Domingo, arriving in early March. At this point, there may have been an attempted mutiny by some of his men. At most, though, the punishment was just stripping the mutineers of their ranks. We'll leave de Sosa for now and talk about another expedition linked to his. Juan Morlet was the other lieutenant governor of Nuevo Leon, in a similar role to de Sosa. He was also the man who would deliver that earlier note to de Sosa, explicitly forbidding him from going to New Mexico. With those orders, he also received a set of orders that if de Sosa did leave, he was to take 40 men and arrest him. His main orders were to turn de Sosa back and to smooth over any hurt relations among the pueblos. The exact route he took is unknown, but he arrived at the Rio Grande in early January. They would arrive in New Mexico in early March. He would arrive at Keres while de Sosa was away. Upon learning of his arrival, de Sosa would hurry back to the pueblo. De Sosa would surrender himself to arrest, and everyone involved would return to Mexico. The return would take a shorter route, possibly closer to the route Oñate would take. Finally, before Oñate's expedition, there's one last one we need to briefly mention, the Levea and Umana expedition. In 1593, Captain Francisco Levea de Bonilla was sent to punish some hostile Tobosos and Galvinez tribes. On the way, he would decide to conquer New Mexico. His superiors would explicitly forbid him from going, but he would just go anyway. Before they set out, one Antonio Gutierrez de Umana would help recruit more men. They would use San Ildefonso Pueblo as their base camp for some time before setting out for Quivira. One of the orders of the later Oñate expedition would be to find and arrest them. We'll talk about the final fate of this expedition when we get to it during the Oñate expedition. Due to these illegal explorations, there would be a push by the Spanish to turn New Mexico, as we saw with the Credula of 1583, into a proper colony through the Crown's approval, and presumably make it easier to control. In the next episode, we'll talk about the selection process for who was going to colonize New Mexico, and get started on the real effort to turn New Mexico into a proper Spanish colony. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.